Hello and welcome. We're here to study blockchain in healthcare. I'm Tommy Cooksey and I will be your instructor through this training. So you don't need to have any prior knowledge of blockchain in order to take this course. We're going to give you pretty much everything that you need to know in order to be able to understand how blockchain technology works in general. And then we're going to look at how that actually applies to the healthcare industry. So we're going to start with a simple overview of really just in general, what is blockchain, how it works, and what kinds of things is it doing for us in general as an industry as a whole. And then we're going to look at healthcare specifically and what various different verticals that it can be used in inside the healthcare industries. So the modules that we're going to be covering for basic blockchain specifics is we're going to talk about what is blockchain and how is it used and what does it do for us. So we're going to be talking about it being a distributed database of immutable data that can never change. And we're going to talk about the differences between an immutable database versus a CRUD database. And we'll talk about why those are different. We're also going to be looking at the cryptography portion of blockchain and talking about how cryptography is used to create the immutability that we're talking about and also to provide provenance and data and also track and traceability. We'll be looking at why we use blockchains in order to create a distributed network of trust. And in essence, that's what a blockchain does, is it gives us the ability to have trust in a trustless environment. We'll be looking at the decentralized networks and different types of decentralized networks that are available, and we'll also be looking at distributed ledger technology. We'll be looking at different types of blockchains, private and public blockchains. We'll look at how blockchains are actually created, and we'll look at how cryptography and actually more specific, how the hashing functionality is used throughout the blockchain ecosystem. We'll actually then take a look at how data gets written to a block by a miner and how a miner has the ability to actually do writes to a blockchain and how that is actually done using proof mechanisms like proof of work and proof of stake. We call these proof mechanisms consensus, and we'll be looking at those too. We'll also be looking at blockchain 2.0, which is our ability to add in the smart contract functionality and how that was done using the Ethereum virtual machine and the Ethereum ecosystem. We'll then take a look at blockchain use cases and how blockchain can be used throughout the healthcare industry and how it is currently being adopted. And we'll look at Web 3.0 technologies such as IoT and AI and see how that can be implemented as well using blockchain. And then lastly, we'll be looking at specific blockchain implementations. So, as we said before, this course has a specific initiative to look at how blockchain is being used in the healthcare industry. So, we are going to have a good deep understanding of what blockchain is, and then we're going to look at how is it actually going to be used in the healthcare industry. So we're going to be looking specifically at various different regulations that have been put in place that we need to ensure that we adhere to. So we'll be looking at being able to conform to regulations. You also need to have a good solid understanding of the core technology to help translate business and functional requirements into technical specs. And so what we mean by that is that when we look at a problem and we look at a functional problem and we look at how that functional problem is affecting our industry as a whole, it's going to be a responsibility of the individuals who are building the systems to be able to take these functional requests and take those and put those into technical requirements or technical specifications that then a developer could use to build out an application or build out the requirements that are needed for whatever's being requested. Also, we need to have the ability to communicate that to those requests or that business requests and requirements so that those developers can design a proof of concept. They can design a minimal viable product, and we can start building solutions. We're going to be looking at different use cases and opportunities within the healthcare industry. More specifically, we're going to be looking at HL7 and FHIR. We'll also be looking at HIPAA regulations, GDPR regulations. We'll also be looking at CFR Part 11 and the Supply Chain Drug Act as well. So we'll be looking at that. So we'll be taking a look at a lot of different regulations and compliance standards that are actually providing opportunities for blockchain. So as the industry as a whole is putting these standards in place, these standards are actually going to be opportunities for blockchain to actually ensure that everyone's adhering to those standards with their data. So we'll be taking a look at those opportunities. We'll also be finding and evaluating healthcare blockchain projects. So we'll be looking at specific blockchain projects. I have about 150 some projects, I think, that we've put on a spreadsheet for you to kind of look at. And then we'll also give you the tools that you need in order to be able to research those projects on your own. So when we think about the importance of innovation, and we think about innovation in the healthcare industry, and we also think about innovation in the finance industry. One of the things that brought the blockchain to such popularity was the frustration with the finance industry and the ability for the finance industry to be able to do secure communications and do secure transmissions of data across the internet to exchange value across the internet. So when we think about the first version of the internet, let's go ahead and just take a step back and we think about the first version or version 1 of the internet. It was all about consumption, right? And so the .com era was about putting your data on some type of readable media and your ability to consume that data. When Web 2.0 came out, Web 2.0 gave us the ability for you to then produce data. So you had the ability to get on Facebook and put your pictures on there and post things. And so now we have production, right? So not only are you consuming, but you're also producing. And so when we start to think about Web 3.0, not only are we producing and consuming, but we're now tracking those transactions, and we're tracking those transactions with an immutable ledger that can tell us what's going on anywhere and everywhere that's happening with the transactions. So what kind of transactions are we tracking? We're tracking transactions that are based around data. And so that data is going to be data that is going to be either data that represents ownership of data or ownership of a physical asset or tangible asset. And it can be lots of other things that are associated with that. So when we apply that to healthcare, and we think about healthcare and how healthcare industry has been some of the slowest to adopt technology, we as a human species should always be interested in the healthcare industry, because at some point in time in our life, this industry will be the most important thing that we have. So at some point in time, we all will have a need for healthcare, and it will be very important to us. And it will be important that that information that's in healthcare is accurate, that it's available, and that it has good integrity, and that we have good confidentiality for our data. And so I think that with blockchain solutions, we can help make that solution a reality. So some of the problems that we have when we think about healthcare, sure, we have innovation, but usually the innovation comes in silos, right? So we'll have innovation in penicillin, or we'll have innovation with surgical methods or something along those lines, but that doesn't necessarily develop innovation throughout the industry. So when we think about vertical innovation versus horizontal innovation, again, vertical innovation is done specifically in a particular field. So as an example, penicillin, polio vaccine, maybe a sophisticated operating method, or maybe other things like that would be examples of vertical innovation, but it's not necessarily a horizontal innovation because it just touches a particular field or particular piece of the industry. But when we think about transactions that occur, transactions occur throughout the entire industry as a whole. When we think about how are we tracking your healthcare information, many times that healthcare information is still stored on a paper vanilla folder. And that is absolutely ridiculous in our day and age. We should have the ability to easily exchange and own our data and have that data readily available to us when we need it. And it should be able to follow us whenever and wherever we go. And so when we think about innovation in data and ownership of data, the first data that we need to own should be our healthcare data. And so when we think about people angry about owning their data on Facebook, I think maybe the data on their healthcare information would be more appropriate to be angry about and be having ownership of. So anyway, I'll get off my tangent there. So anyway, some horizontal innovations that we've seen and that we also see with blockchain now, and it's touching pretty much all industries, is we've seen it with electricity. You know, when electricity came along, obviously that was a big innovation. We see it with the internet, we see it with cloud computing, and pretty much all other horizontal innovations where adoption in fields are making industries much more efficient. I like to many times cite a paper at this point by a gentleman named Marc Andreessen. Marc Andreessen was one of the founders of Netscape. And he also is the leader of Andreessen Horowitz Investments. And Marc Andreessen wrote a paper in 2007, I believe, that said software is eating the world. And before he wrote that paper, he cited things like Bill Gates going into Microsoft. He talked about Airbnb, he talked about Amazon, Blockbuster. And as we look at these various different areas or these various different sectors of innovation, we can see that all software is doing is it's simply removing friction. And as we remove friction in industry, software provides innovation and it provides opportunities. And so blockchain is simply allowing us as a whole, as a consortium, to look at ways that we can remove friction for various different industries and using the industries as a whole to remove that friction. And so I think that we'll be able to do that with a lot of different blockchain initiatives. So anyway, so what are some of the biggest problems that we run into in healthcare that we're going to see initiatives for blockchain? Probably one of the first ones is going to be the self-sovereign identity, and that's not necessarily a healthcare initiative, but it is an initiative that we see throughout blockchain. And what self-sovereign identity is our ability to own our identity. So we have the ability to say, yes, I am Tommy Cooksey, and I can go to the Department of Motor Vehicles and I can prove that by providing the information that's required for them to be able to do that. When I do that, they provide me with the proof. They give me an ID card. What if I could put that on a blockchain? What if I could then have that readily available as a digital ID, and then I could provide that ID anytime that I needed to provide my ID without providing all the additional information that's on my identification card? What if I wanted to provide the additional information about my credentials as a surgeon, and I'm going into surgery and I need to provide those credentials before I go into surgery? It needs to be ensured that I have all the credentials that are required in order for me to be able to perform that operation, and it needs to ensure that all the individuals that are being performing any operation or doing anything within the hospital have the appropriate credentials that they need. And so how can we track and trace credentials on a blockchain? Self-sovereign identity will help us do that. And so in addition to self-sovereign identity, probably one of the other biggest things that we see in a blockchain is, and especially in healthcare, is the ability for us to take the data that's being held in these healthcare silos or these different healthcare provider systems and have that data be interoperable. Right now we have various vendors that are doing what many people call information blocking. They're not necessarily sharing information between them. And so what we need to do is we need to create interoperability so that the data that is being held for a health information is going to be readily available to an individual so that they can read and have ownership of their data. And so, so interoperability is going to be huge for us, and we're going to be taking a look at a project called FHIR from HL7 that is not necessarily a blockchain project, but is a project about standardization, and I think the standardization will help drive interoperability. So, and then another biggest problem, again, as I mentioned, is information blocking. And so, so let's go ahead and talk a little bit deeper about identifying patients and actually self-sovereign identity, and then we'll talk a little bit about information blocking. So the problem with identifying patients is matching a person to their health record is really hard. And so it's not only hard, but it's really critical for the person that's actually needing that medical information. And it needs to be accurate. It needs to be 100% 100% secure. Let me give you an example. In telemedicine, if my doctor is in New York and I'm in California and I fall and break my leg and I need my doctor to review the x-rays in New York, I don't want a doctor here in California to review those x-rays. I want my practitioner in New York to review those x-rays. And so how can I ensure that those x-rays get sent specifically to that doctor? I can use a blockchain in order to ensure that the x-rays that were taken here in California are sent specifically to my doctor in New York, and I can ensure the validity of those x-rays using hashing algorithms. And so we can do track and traceability of our x-rays. It's important. And if you know anything about the telemedicine problem, there's actually a problem there. There's a problem where there's about a 13 to 15% ratio, I think, something like that, where patients are, or up to 20% where patients aren't actually getting their health records matched even within the same healthcare system. And then when you move between systems, it can be up to half. Up to half of the stuff could be mismatched. And so that's just not acceptable. It's not acceptable that if I'm not in the right place and in the right system, if I have to transfer my records between systems, that I'm taking and rolling the dice that my data is correct. And that's just not acceptable. So we have to fix that. So how can a blockchain help solve these problems? It is immutable. A blockchain is immutable, meaning that the data never changes. And so we're going to show you how that works as we go through the blockchain ledgers and show you the different architecture of a blockchain, but we'll show you how the hashes work and how these hashes tie the blocks together. We'll also talk about traceability, and we'll talk about how we can do traceability through the blockchain so we can track and trace all transactions all the way back to zero. And so once we can do that, then we can actually give that data available back to the patient so that then they can use that data within whatever ecosystem that they choose to go to, a provider or whatever network that they're using. And so also, medical records generated and added to the blockchain are going to be completely secure. And so we'll talk more about hashed pointers and how we can use hash indexes in order to point to the data. But the data would be just as secure as it is today, and so or more secure. Information blocking. We mentioned information blocking earlier, but many times, especially when we think about EHR records and patient data, that there's an unreasonable constraint imposed on the exchange of that data. And a lot of times that is done because of various different regulations. And so when we think about this concept of information blocking, there was actually criteria specified in HIPAA that defined that if a vendor knowingly or unreasonably interferes with the exchange and use of electronic health information, which is a right protected by the HIPAA Act, then they can be prosecuted for that and charged. And so the criteria for that would be that they would there has been interference and there has been knowledge of that interference, and there's no reason for the data to not be accessible. And so I think that probably that is something that that a lot of these EHR companies should be aware of. And so what we're going to be covering throughout this course, again, is we're going to cover the basics of blockchain. We're then going to move into some regulations and compliance. We're going to talk about actually standards, and we're going to talk about how standards have been put in place with HL7 and the HL7 initiative that was put in place back in the 80s, and then how that's kind of progressed over the years, and we're in HL7 version 4, which is actually called FHIR. And so we'll take a look at that. And actually that's FHIR, not HFIR. I think it's a little off there on our slide. And then the patient identity in the blockchain. So then we're going to move into patient identity in the blockchain. And so there what we're going to do is we're going to look at some standards that affect patient identity. We're going to look at things like HIPAA. We're also going to look at GDPR regulations and talk about your right to be forgotten and data minimalization and some of the various different regulations that we have within HIPAA and GDPR and how they affect affect patient identity. Once we're done with that, we're going to move into Internet of Things. We're going to talk about IoT devices and how they can be used to collect specific healthcare information, and then how we can get a better holistic view of the entire healthcare ecosystem, and also give you more precision medicine by using more detailed information in order to give you that precision medicine. We'll also look at digital assets in the blockchain, and so we'll talk about things like your health record and also like your health information that could be an asset that could be used for clinical trials. We'll also look at value-based care and concepts, and so right now we have more of a service-based system where healthcare systems are based around how much, or the revenue that they bring in is based around how much services that they put out, whereas maybe the value that's provided from those services should be more of the measurement that we use, the key performance indicator that we use to track that. We're also going to look at AI in healthcare, and so when we look at AI, people get very scared when we think about AI, and so AI shouldn't make you scared. All AI is doing what you told it to do, and it's learning on its own, and it's basically trying to find the best solution to whatever problem is available. And so what we could do with AI is we could take a look at things like your genomic string. We could look at people within your geographical region that are susceptible to certain conditions. We could look at things like prior conditions that you've had within your health record. We could look at things like other medications that you might have taken in the past that have given you problems. And we could actually maybe give you precision recovery plan that would give you specific medication that's been created specifically for you. So that medication is actually created specifically for you, for your recovery, and it has specific milligrams of whatever medical resources inside of it that it needs in order to help you in your recovery. So anyway, AI in healthcare could be a very, very great solution. We'll take a look at that as well. And that's going to wrap out our day tomorrow. Or on day 2, and then on day 3, we're going to be looking at supply chain. And so supply chain in healthcare is going to deal specifically with a lot of track and traceability. We need to really track from source all the way to patient of everything that happens, especially with drugs and any medical devices. And so we need to ensure that those medical devices have good track and traceability on them, and also provenance. And so we'll be looking at how we can use the blockchain in order to do that for us. We'll also be looking at patient-enabled blockchains. So this is in essence going to give ownership of healthcare data back to the patient. And so the patient will then be able to leverage that data to get free resources, to get tokens, health tokens, whatever, however you want to incentivize the patient. We'll also be looking at data sets, and so towards the end of the day, on our final day, or towards our last discussion, we will be talking about specifically how data gets modeled and traditional data models. We'll talk about the back end part of the data, the middle tier of the data, and then the front end of the data. And then we'll talk about how the back end part of the data can kind of be changed quite a bit with transactional data, because really that's where we're focusing all of our blockchain kind of attention, is all on data sets and transactional data. So we're going to really kind of take a close look at transactional data and how blockchains can help with that transactional data. And then lastly, we'll look at different blockchain opportunities that are out there today within healthcare, and also projects that are currently running within the healthcare space, and how you can kind of take a look at those and see if any of those meet some of your objectives. So we hope you enjoy the course, and we hope this is very informative to you, and let's get started.